Hi, everyone. I think we're live now. Welcome to another episode of, excuse me, Breakthrough Science with Prime Movers Lab. I'm Gavin Mathis, the Communications and Government Relations Partner at Prime Movers Lab, and we have an awesome panel today of policy experts who can help us kind of walk through President Biden's fiscal year 2024 R&D budget items, as well as the ongoing debates around the debt ceiling negotiations that are going on right now. Some of you might be aware that there's floor debate right now on Speaker McCarthy's debt ceiling bill. So we'll hopefully be able to dive in that conversation a lot with the panelists. Before we get too far along, just want to thank all of the LPs and founders who are joining us today. And for those of you who may not be as familiar with PML, we are a deep tech venture capital firm that invests in breakthrough science companies that are in the transportation, energy, human augmentation, manufacturing, infrastructure, and agriculture spaces. So before we get too far along, I'd love to do just a quick round of intros. Maybe we can start with Pritha, Marissa, then Matt and Mike real quick.
Hi, I'm Pritha Ghosh. I'm a partner at Prime Movers Lab, and I have a background in chemical engineering and defense analysis.
Hi, I'm Marissa Serafino. I'm an associate at Holland and Knight in Washington, D.C. I'm an attorney working in the government section. I primarily work on national security and technology related issues. Most of my days recently have been taken up by the CHIPS Act. And before joining the firm, I worked in the Senate for Senator Shaheen for more than 4 years.
Hi, I'm Matt Hourihan. I'm Associate Director for R&D and Advanced Industry at the Federation of American Scientists. Prior to FAS, I've been with FAS for about a year, and previously I was with AAAS for many years as their lead federal science budget analyst.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike O'Neill. I'm a lawyer with the law firm K&L Gates. My practice is primarily in the energy sector. Over the last 10 years or so, I've worked on pretty much everything from hydrocarbons to hydropower to renewables to you name it. But the last several years, my practice is really focused primarily on the emerging fusion energy sector. Just to level set, that's fusion, where you bring the nuclei of atoms together and release energy, as opposed to fission, which is what we use in conventional nuclear power plants around the world today. It splits heavier atoms apart. So I'm more on the fusion side of the equation, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you guys so much. To kick things off, I feel like we probably should just start with the debt ceiling bill that's being negotiated now. When we wanted to host this webinar a couple months ago, we just were going to dive into Biden's budget. And we didn't think like today of all days was going to be the day that's actually on the House floor and right in the middle of everything. So we just kind of want to dive in there because we just kind of want to get people up to speed about what exactly this entails, what the impact it could have on R&D funding, or if there's even chances of large portions of this bill actually getting through the Senate, and if Biden would ever sign it. So I think, Matt, you did an excellent piece of analysis that kind of outlines what this would entail for federal R&D over the next decade or so. And you might be a good person to start with just kind of what that looks like and kind of give people a high picture of kind of what's in store here.
Yeah, so I guess maybe from a science spending perspective, I'll just start with what the proposal actually does and how it relates most directly for R&D investments. Key part of the bill is a set of spending caps that would start in the upcoming fiscal year, 2024. And in 2024, it would roll back what's known as discretionary spending back to 2022 levels. It's a pretty sizable cut for spending. And then cap spending, almost flat for the rest of the decade. And it affects what's known as the discretionary budget. So this is the part of the budget that's allocated, allocated every year annually through the appropriations process. And it's where just about all federal science spending lives, right? There's some spending that's allocated through other means. A lot of the semiconductor spending was mandatory spending or direct spending. But most research and most of the big chips and science priorities are allocated through the discretionary budget. Now, by capping discretionary spending over a decade, it ultimately rolls back, it has the effect of rolling back spending below what the Congressional Budget Office calculates as their long-term baseline. So the upshot for R&D, what we calculate is that over the next decade, we'd be looking at about $500 billion less available for R&D below baseline. That's about almost a 20% reduction in what we might expect under the kind of normal, CBO baseline. That said, that's total R&D. But the other twist here is that not only, while the bill itself only caps discretionary spending over the decade, House Republicans have already said that they want to protect and likely increase defense spending. So if those spending limitations only fall on the non-defense or civilian side of the ledger, and non-defense spending is expected to make up the entirety of the spending limitations, then we'll be looking at something like 40% reductions over the decade for agencies like the National Science Foundation, NASA, NIH, NIST. Again, a lot of those agencies that were called out in CHIPS and Science. So it would be very difficult, for Congress. There's been a lot of talk of increasing federal science investment. The caps that are in play right now, if they were to become law, would make it very, very difficult for the federal government to meet that rhetoric with actual investment over the coming years.
That's incredibly helpful. Mike, Marissa, anything kind of in areas of that you guys are particularly following? And then obviously I kind of want to just open up the conversation, but how do you actually see the debate playing out over the next few months before we hit the ceiling, really? Obviously this is kind of a first offer from the Republicans. Biden said he just wants a clean debt ceiling limit. So I'm kind of curious of the dynamics that you see playing out over the next few months.
I'll take the first shot there. I think that the Democrats seem united on this front, so that will play into how the back and forth goes here. But I think it's also somewhat difficult for Republicans, many of whom voted for CHIPS and Science Act and have, they understand the national security implications of rolling back this funding or just diminishing it over time to those national security objectives that sort of everyone agrees are important. And so the actual impact of what happens when you actually implement such a bill will become real, and that will hopefully steer folks in the direction of coming to some sort of compromise, which they need to actually do. So some type of debt ceiling deal will happen, but it just depends on where things shake out.
Yeah, and just to kind of use my fusion experience as a vignette, I'm sure that I'm preaching to the choir when I just note that, R&D today is job creation tomorrow, and the investments that we don't make today are investments that our geopolitical competitors are making and will make. And we see it particularly in the fusion space. China is a major investor in this sector. The EU and the UK are similarly global competitors with the US. And I can tell you that conversations with policymakers really get exciting when you describe the investments that some of our competitors are making. So, ignoring the kind of news cycle politics of it all, I think it will really be helpful for players to emphasize the geopolitical implications of failing to make these investments over time.
Do you see any particular parts of the IRA or CHIPS, obviously not the semiconductor incentives that were appropriate already, but all the rest of the R&D funding that was included in CHIPS that may get on the chopping block that's most likely to be kind of negotiated? Or do you think it does end up being more of a clear extension into sometime next year, which is an election year? I mean, is there anything particular that you think might be negotiated in talks between McCarthy and Biden?
Well, I'm not much of a political prognosticator, but I'll just kind of note that the closer we get to an election, the more fraught the politics will become. So, there's a lot more room for wheeling and dealing now, probably, rather than, if we extend to March of 24, which seems to be what the trend is in the House bill.
And I'll add too, just whatever, wheeling and dealing may happen between the political principles here, their space to maneuver gets much more narrow. The harder line we see on spending. I mean, if spending's got to come down a little bit or it stays flat or whatever happens, I mean, there's a certain political equilibrium in lots of elements of the science budget, I think. And, there's lots of players involved that are going to want to see their key accounts and their key, their favorite programs not lose any ground. And so on the topic of chips and science priorities, there's certainly areas where I think they can probably agree, but if the spending isn't there, the big picture spending isn't there to enable the additional investments, it's going to limit what's really possible in terms of negotiations.
I wouldn't say that anything is necessarily on the chopping block at this point. Obviously, there's a lot of carryover from chips and science of programs that weren't appropriated and are still waiting for appropriations, and we'll see some of those in the FY 2024 process, and then in potentially other bills as well. But I'd say the dynamics are already different than the Chips and Science Act time, because the House, as we know very well, is run by Republicans. And so, like my colleagues were mentioning, that just changes the political dynamics from the outset. And so it just depends on who in the appropriations process can get their priorities across the table. I think anything related to semiconductors and the CHIPS program office implementation of those semiconductor incentives, that's probably going to take the day. A lot of program requirements really bring into the conversation other programs that were included in the Chips and Science Act, like the Manufacturing USA Institutes and other programs on STEM education, et cetera. And applicants are encouraged, if not required, to engage in those programs. And so there's more incentive there to have the appropriations secured so that engagement can occur and we see that growth. So I think it will just depend on for the document this year in the appropriations process.
That's great. Pritha, did you want to, I think you had a question about kind of committee activity, or like just if there's anything that's come out of that?
Yeah, so this is actually directed at Marissa specifically to think about to follow on what you were just talking about with regards to the CHIPS Act. So in the recent weeks, a bunch of agency heads have testified before congressional committees about the budgets. So what stood out to you about Commerce, DOE, NSF, their budget requests with respect to the CHIPS Act?
Yeah, sure. I think it's, in addition to the actual appropriations, the appropriations process is such a great opportunity for members to conduct oversight. And so that's where we also see this come into play when it gets to the CHIPS and Science Act and the programs therein. But in terms of the actual hearings themselves, there was a lot of discussion about the implementation of the CHIPS program office and how that is going, and then how the ancillary programs to that, feed in. And like my colleagues were saying, everyone has their pet project. So whether it was, the tech hubs that were discussed, whether it was the, Manufacturing USA Institutes, everyone sort of is touching base on those, seeing how the implementation there is going, and then what additional funding is needed for this year. One of the things that stood out to me was that there was really broad bipartisan support still for chips. And one of the members said, thank you for spending 7 hours in a skiff with me so that I could get to a yes on that bill. And, that sort of was really impactful for me, because if that's what we need to do to get people to a place where they can support these R&D initiatives, it is a pathway. It's one of the, I think, many, options that agencies have in this type of political environment.
And that's a good transition, just because I'm kind of curious of the dynamics on the committees now, is we have so many new chairmen, so many new members in the House. Leadership switched over, so you've got like Frank Lucas taking over the House Science Committee, Chuck Fleischman on House Propes Energy and Water Subcommittee. Mike, I think you probably have like a take on why Fleischman's role is kind of interesting, because he's from the District of Oak Ridge National Lab, and we'd love to just kind of get everyone's take about, have any members who kind of stood out in this process who are new chairman, new ranking members, and who've kind of like really stepped in to lead new initiatives? Like I know Frank Lucas cares a lot about NOAA and kind of weather because of his agriculture background. Is there anything else that's kind of like stood out to you guys?
Well, I'm happy to start off. Congressman Fleischman is certainly a really interesting case here. As you mentioned, he's the congressional rep for Oak Ridge. That is a very large fusion account. It's where the international, or I should say the U.S. contribution to the international fusion experiment in the south of France flows through Oak Ridge. Chuck Fleischman has been was the Republican co-founder of the Fusion Energy Caucus several years ago with Don Beyer on the Democratic side. And one thing that I think is pretty interesting is that Chuck Fleischman has taken a role not only as the chair of the Probe Subcommittee on Energy and Water, but also a seat on the House Science Committee, which is a pretty rare thing for an appropriator to take a seat on the authorizing committee. It happens, but particularly a chairman of a subcommittee here taking this role, he's going to see himself coming and going as he authorizes programs across the science accounts, and then goes and writes the check across the hall. I think it's emblematic of his enthusiasm for these programs, that he's really taking a very assertive role here. We just hosted, our firm hosted the Fusion Industry Association's annual policy conference about 3.5 weeks ago down in DC. And, Representative Fleischman was very effusive in his praise for the fusion program. And so, it's not surprising that he's jumping in with both feet. So we're excited to see where he takes this program on the House side.
Yeah, Matt, Marissa, anyone else kind of stand out to you?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll mention Hal Rogers of Kentucky is the new chair of the Commerce Justice Science Subcommittee, which funds NSF, NIST, among the CHIPS and science agencies, as well as NASA. And he's an interesting one. It's actually not, clear what he's going to do yet on his bill and what his priorities are going to be exactly, agency by agency. He's an interesting one. He's been around for a long time. He previous chair of the Appropriations Committee. He's somebody who, will likely prioritize things like EPSCoR. It's the program to broaden geographic distribution of NSF funding, beyond those few states that receive the most in grant awards. Kentucky is a state that benefits from it, and I would expect Rogers to want to prioritize that kind of program that more broadly distributes agency funding to his home state. That may or may not mean that he ends up building in a lot of support for some of the new initiatives like the NSF Tech Directorate, for example. It's an open question. We'll see what happens and how he funds it. But I think, during hearings, and this is actually more general comment about a lot of the new folks, you often hear a lot of positive rhetoric about tech investment, about the role of federal R&D in basic science, especially the importance of global competition. But you also often hear in virtually the same breath about the need to control spending. You see legislators kind of looking hard for reasons to fund or not fund, different programs, to go back to Marissa's point earlier. So, I mean, in some ways there's almost like a Jekyll and Hyde, personality to Congress when we're in times like this where spending appears to, about to be tight. There's a lot of priorities that a lot of folks actually do care about quite a bit, but they also are grappling with the fact that there's just not going to be enough, not going to be much, too many dollars available. And so they have to make really tough choices. And, somebody like Rogers is in a position to have, some pretty outsized influence on some of these chips. And so, the and science part of the Chips and Science Act, and we'll see what kinds of choices he makes.
I totally agree, Matt. I think taking this in a bit of a different direction, I think it will also, with the new faces, increase the importance of the Senate counterparts. So who have the, foundational experience, have been doing it for a while, Senator Shaheen, Senator Moran, and, those are going to be, especially their staff, when Four Corners meet and they're going over priorities, that makes a big difference if you've been doing this for a long time and you have your priorities down and kind of understand the state of play. So mixing it up a little bit is good, I think, in that sense. New priorities will come to the top and, gain a bit more attention, but there is something you said for, those more veteran members on the committees.
That's a good point.
I wanted to move to Mike's specialty, because despite everything we were just talking about with regards to how tight the budget is looking, fusion energy is not not an area, is an area where we are seeing alignment. So I'd love to hear why House Republicans seem to be so supportive of fusion energy.
Sure. And just to preface, when everyone else's budgets are flat or going down and you're the one bright spot, that is not an ideal place to be politically. That puts something of a target on your account. And so, as you say, it's welcome to have a broadening base of support across the Republican caucus, particularly in the House. I would say we've talked a little bit about Chuck Fleischman and his enthusiasm for this endeavor. There are a couple of other folks that I would put in the same breath. J.L. Bernalty out of California is very excited about fusion. He has joined the Fusion Energy Caucus. He's, rallied support around the NRC process for fusion. Mike Garcia also, I think he's out of California too. He has he brought up fusion in this hearing with Secretary Granholm and emphasized its importance. Like Chuck Fleischman, he also serves on the House Science Committee, so he's similarly positioned to, write, I guess, pay for the checks that he writes in the authorizing side. And then the other kind of maybe bigger batch of support could come out of the Conservative Climate Caucus that we've seen some interest there, although I wouldn't want to get too far out ahead of myself before those members really render their own opinion on the program. But you're right that the Biden administration has put fusion on its agenda. Last year, the the Biden White House hosted a symposium essentially to, or maybe a summit is better said, to announce a bold decadal vision to commercialize fusion energy, which is very highfalutin rhetoric and really didn't make much difference until the full weight of the government went behind the program. That's had started with the issuance of the milestone-based cost share program that DOE put out last year. Maybe we'll see some announcements on that soon, but it's really bolstered by the president's budget request that pumps up the fusion budget to north of $1 billion. And that's, across both, public-private partnerships, like partnerships with the national labs to support fusion development. It's also to support national test stands that can, accelerate the commercialization across the whole industry, not just for, single companies. There's no doubt that the investments across the industry by public investors, such as prime movers, but other major public and private, I should say, major private investments have engendered some public support. And I'd also note the very substantial tech demonstration out of Lawrence Livermore National Lab at the end of last year. The National Ignition Facility finally reached ignition, demonstrating net energy from fusion reactions in a controlled setting. Mind-bogglingly important from a technology development perspective, and yet extremely predictable based on the trajectories across the community over the last few years. And lastly, as something that can really boost additional political support is the trajectory around safety. Just about 10 days ago, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission rendered a decision that formally removes commercial fusion from the fission regulatory concept or construct, essentially deciding to regulate fusion machines and their materials within them akin to a particle accelerator or some sort of industrial user machine, as not a fission power plant. This is a regulatory decision that has real implications because it is a game changer. It lowers the obstacle for permitting from about $1 billion for a fission power plant to something, a tenth of that or less, hopefully well less than that. It should speed up the process by a decade or so. So it's a very exciting development for the industry. And frankly, politically, it grants a imprimatur from the safety regulator to political supporters saying that, yes, we agree with industry that this is a safe technology and the risk can be fully mitigated by controls that are well established across multiple other industries. So that paired with the geopolitical and other aspects that we've already touched on can start to really bulk out the support for the fusion sector in Congress.
A few points I just wanted to reiterate there. I think you made a couple interesting things I wanted to highlight, because in terms of we look at a few things: the science risk, business risk, the Livermore success really put a lot of the science risk behind us. I think we're as an investor, we're very, we've always been very gung-ho on fusion, but that makes us feel even better about it, seeing something like that. And then to your point about the Fusion Summit, our former colleague Carly Anderson moderated one of the panels at the summit. And so, we've been thrilled to see all the progress since the summit, just in terms of retiring a lot of the regulatory risk. So we're thrilled to hear about all the progress since, especially the NRC news as of as you said, a week and a half ago.
Yeah, it's a fresh decision. It starts to really set a firm trajectory internationally. It's a very similar approach the UK has taken. The IAEA is starting up conversations about this as well. So, we're starting to see some real kind of snowball effects of really rolling this big regulatory snowball downhill.
And just to emphasize Mike's point, as somebody who's followed Office of Science, investments for a while, it wasn't that long ago that most of the attention in that program, or a lot of the attention was on the international activities, right? They've always sustained these investments in domestic fusion research capability, but they've always also had a big and growing funding wedge that goes towards the ITER International Fusion Energy Project. And in the budget that Mike mentioned, ITER ended up flat or maybe cut slightly, and all of this big increase was on the domestic side for public-private partnerships. So I was definitely struck, to Mike's point, was definitely struck by what seems to be a new day and a new age in the program. It was a very different kind of budget than we're used to seeing, I think.
I'm so glad we went down it's not truly a digression, I think, even though it sounds like, oh, the NRC, that's not the budget, but I think these things are all related. And I also, I saw that headline, I was excited. So thank you for explaining that a bit more. I'd love to hear from everybody, what are other areas where you see alignment between the administration and House Republicans in terms of science?
I'll take the first stab there. One of the things that I think, again, this is going to be somewhat from my putting on my CHIPS hat, is this concept of lab to fab, which Secretary Raimondo uses all the time to sort of explain CHIPS and how they're thinking about it. I think that's very applicable to many of the R&D and science priorities of the administration. And the idea there is that you really need to start the investments in the lab in order to get to commercialization and products, and making sure that that is all done domestically, right? So that's the national security piece. So I think anything with the national security backdrop that is in that sort of vein and trying to achieve those types of objectives, if it's coined in that way, I think there is definitely going to be alignment there. Senator Schumer, I think, understands that and also sees the need. I think the rumor is that he's going to try to do a China 2.0 competitiveness bill. And that is one of the two priorities for the rest of the year outside of mandatory extensions that have to be done. And so that could be an area where there is some agreement. I don't know that anything will actually be passed, like, coming closer to the election, that becomes more complicated, but there could be some leftovers from the iterations of the CHIPS and Science Act, like USICA, Endless Frontiers, that there is still some appetite to see through to appropriations or additional efforts as well.
I totally agree with Marissa. I think another kind of twist I'd add, in addition to the national security connections, there's also, there's just has always been kind of a long-term, maybe the single biggest long-term point of dispute politically over R&D investments is over early stage basic science funding, which everybody tends to agree on a lot more, versus more downstream tech research investments. So often when we are in years like the current one, where spending is going to be tightened, you end up seeing the tech programs and the more kind of downstream applied or engineering oriented programs tend to be more vulnerable. So I think we may be in a situation where those programs that are able to combine that national security focus, the competitiveness focus, with a more basic science orientation or an earlier stage orientation may work out well. It may work out well for them. For another example would be the microelectronics research centers. These were authorized in CHIPS and Science. They were included in the Office of Science budget. I forget how much they requested, but and these are very much associated with U.S. Semiconductor performance and some of the same themes that we saw in CHIPS and Science. But they're also can be cast as basic science or pretty early stage research at the national labs, which again, as we've covered, are favored by Representative Fleischman. So those kinds of programs, I think, could end up playing well.
Mike, anything else or?
Well, maybe I could take off my fusion hat for a moment and just note a couple other, I think writ large, nuclear has a ton of support that played out in the questioning for Secretary Granholm just a couple weeks ago at the House Appropriations Committee. That's fission, fusion, everything in between. And that plays into some of the national security implications that we're talking about, the energy security that is, fundamental to a national security strategy. The other area, and this is maybe not quite so scientific, is permitting reform. Permitting for infrastructure. It's great to have all these brand new energy generation technologies, everything from hydrogen to new types of nuclear, fission, fusion. But what are you going to do if you can't connect it to the grid? And so, we've got a preface of it last year in the Joe Manchin permitting extravaganza. We're probably going to see some version of it again, as part of the debt negotiation or somewhere else. It will be a part of the conversation, and frankly, I think it would be welcome to a lot of the industry, the energy industry generally.
And that's definitely one thing that was in McCarthy's bill that caught our attention. That was in HR 1, and we were, obviously curious about it. I mean, our former fellow Liza Reed, we just did a research paper on kind of transmission lines and what a bottleneck that is. And so, I mean, it's definitely something we've been able to we're curious about and love to, see some progress in that area as well. Before I go on to the next question, I just want to remind listeners, please submit questions in the Q&A function here or in chat, or tweet us on, or just send us a tweet at Prime Movers Lab. My next question here is just Matt, you made the point earlier, you did a good job of outlining that a lot of these in McCarthy's bill, it goes after a lot more discretionary spending rather than defense spending. So I'm kind of curious if you see a lot more kind of R&D activity move to DoD as a result. I mean, I know the applied basic research, it looked like they got a buzz in Biden's budget, but I assume that was probably politics. Those numbers were going to go back up during negotiations. People wanted that. It was just DoD wanting to, ask for that money somewhere else. And there was something they knew they were going to get a chunk of change out of for R&D there. So I'm kind of curious. I mean, this is just kind of spitballing, but I'm curious if you think more R&D activity ends up going to DoD because it's going to be protected more, or if we get some sort of deal or just caps, or just in general with a Republican majority in the House, and who knows how the election plays out in 2024.
Yeah, I think at least in the near term, in the next couple of years, I would expect DoD to do a bit better on the R&D front. To your point about defense basic science. I mean, it's often, we've had several years now where defense basic science in the request gets cut. Pentagon prioritizes other things, and then yes, Congress pluses it back up. And I would expect a similar kind of dynamic in play this year. Congress often likes university support for university programs. They like the military. They like funding the military research offices. And yeah, with the dynamic in the House and, non-defense spending, even if, odds are probably against non-defense spending being cut by quite as much as what's being proposed in McCarthy's bill. But even if it is, that doesn't happen, we're still likely going to see some constraint, as we have in the last couple of years under Democratic Congresses in the non-defense budget. I mean, that's the other thing maybe worth pointing out, is that we've actually had a couple of years in a row where defense spending has outpaced non-defense in the final summation, in the final omnibus. So no reason to expect, that gap to change. And in fact, it will likely widen, I would expect, again, at least for the next couple of years, and then we'll see what happens beyond.
We actually have a question from Maximilian Winter, one of our LPs here. What about healthcare, life science, and space telecom infrastructure technologies? Are those a priority, and how much funding is going towards them? I know we can have a fusion semiconductor heavy group here, but any insights into the kind of life sciences and how what Department of Health and Human Services will be getting, ARPA-H, the cancer moonshot, anything kind of there that has stood out to you guys?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are, big priorities. I mean, Congress has really favored a lot of life sciences research in the last few years. President's budget was quite modest when it came to NIH. The dynamic there is an interesting one, because the labor-age spending bill, which funds NIH and ARPA-H and these others, I mean, that's going to be a tough bill. There's going to be a lot that's a lot that Republicans may want to strip out of it. It's probably not going to, the growth or the reduction in that, the reduction may be greater in that bill. So, I think it could be a particularly tight year for programs funded through it. We'll see if NIH is protected, and I mean, cancer research is one of those bipartisan areas that in years past, there hasn't been any issue in getting NIH, $2 billion, $3 billion plus up. But that could be an area where, the kind of the micro level political preferences run into the macro level buzzsaw fiscal politics.
Anything else, Mike, Marissa?
I would be speaking out of turn.
Sure, no worries.
Yeah, this
I mean,
is
well, yeah.
far outside my area.
With I'm trying to think of what advice would you give startups that are kind of in this or looking at the budget, looking at the debate right now, who might be worried about who benefited from working chips or the IRA? They got a good tax provision in the IRA, or they're looking at some grant as part of chips. Any advice for those founders, kind of how to make their voice heard the most on Capitol Hill? I mean, we have two lobbyists here, so we'll really love your take of kind of just counsel for founders who might be on this call and are looking to kind of make their voice heard on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I mean, the first and foremost piece of advice I would say is make sure that you are very buttoned up on the application side. If you understand your narrative and you can, you have sort of checked all of the boxes under the NOFO, that is probably going to be, that's foundational, and that's going to be the most important thing when you go into Capitol Hill offices, and you go into the agency and you talk to partners and you talk to, others that you may be partnering with in what, is called a, consortium or a cluster under the first NOFO for chips. Like, those are the really important things. This idea that you have a coalition of support is critical, right? So when you're going to your members of Congress and trying to get their support, the first thing to go into any meeting with is understanding what you're asking for and where you sit in that ecosystem and how you're going to comply with a very burdensome process. Commercial viability is one of those 6 prongs of the criteria of the NOFO. And so that is going to be audited and looked at very closely. The due diligence process will be very intense. So making sure that you have that ironed out before going to the Hill is important.
And yeah, from my perspective on the energy side, and to note, I'm not a lobbyist. I'm just more of a energy lawyer who follows it closely. from my little fusion silo, I think engagement with the national labs is critical. They are the crown jewel of certainly the energy R&D ecosystem, as Marissa referenced. They want to make, every member of Congress wants to make sure that their national lab is well resourced and protected from cuts. So if you work with one, if not, what are you doing? They're great. But if you work with one, make sure your rep knows that's part of your story. Similarly in other sectors, I'm sure work with NASA, other agencies, NIST, as Matt mentioned earlier, even universities. These are force multipliers for your message. Even though they're not, many of these entities cannot, directly lobby Congress, they can tell their story. And you are not only do they, create a constituency hook for you that broader than just your physical footprint, but also work with these entities is very validating, particularly for early stage companies. So highly recommend working with the national labs. And a separate but similarly important point is make sure you have your job story. Obviously, we're very early for a lot of these. A lot of your portfolio companies are early stage. Some are not. Some are creating numerous jobs across an entire supply chain. Know your story. Every politician speaks jobs. That's the language they understand. That is a short-term boom in your politicking. So know your story, know it across the supply chain, know where it's coming from, domestically, internationally. It's all going to be part of your story, and learn it and publicize it.
That's great. Another quick question from the audience. Do you believe the final resolution to the budget reductions to achieve debt ceiling and limit increase will be cherry picked, or do you think it's going to be percentage declines across agencies or percentage decreases across non-defense discretionary areas? So interesting question. Like, is it going, do you think we're going to have debate around going and finding, wherever those little pockets of money would be, or are we just going to see hard caps, which the McCarthy bill kind of introduces that idea? Or do you think in the negotiation process, we're going to see some real winners and losers in it?
I mean, if history is any guide, the final deal will look something like just basically one or two big numbers on overall discretionary spending areas. Then it'll be up to the various committees we talked about, Rogers and Fleischman and their counterparts in the Senate to actually write the spending bills and make the specific choices agency by agency, program by program.
Yeah, agreed. I would note that there has been some horse trading already, just to cherry pick certain programs. The one that got a lot of attention over the last 24 hours has been in the biofuels space. So there's already some at least protectionism, whether or not we would call those winners or losers. There's certainly some local constituencies that are surviving the first round of cuts here.
Maybe last question here as we wrap up. We're heading into an election year very soon, election process. People are announcing. What role do you think Biden's success is? I mean, he's got to point to IRA and CHIPS as two main reasons for his reelection, and two very big achievements. How do you see R&D kind of being impacted in the presidential race, or just in all the House and Senate races next year? And do you think, I'm just generally curious of how you see the political dynamics of a presidential year playing out with some of the areas that we care about?
I think the spending will be the amount of spending, right? And the sort of runaway spending that Republicans will sort of talk about on the campaign trail is something that the Democrats will have to grapple with. But the way that I think the Biden administration has tried to present those funding opportunities is that this is a national security issue. I know I've talked about this many times, but that it is required and we have to make these types of investments. So I think it comes down, as it always does, to sort of messaging and how that is accepted or not accepted by the electorate. But you'll certainly see talking points on both sides of the aisle that we've seen in the past, but you had such a bipartisan effort on the CHIPS Act that I do think that there's going to be sort of less criticism around the $52 billion invested there. And it will be, part of the way that Democrats explain their agenda in the next 4 years. And then Republicans, I think, have the same concerns about national security, especially related to China. I think that's one area that's we hear that through and through. We have a select committee on China in the House now, run by Rep. Gallagher. And that will be, again, part of the, area that we'll see agreement over the next year or so before the election. And it'll be interesting to see how that translates to the campaign trail.
Yeah, I would just, to piggyback on that one a little bit, all politics are local, and the way that CHIPS and IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law have been implemented have kind of put a lot of investment into purple and red states. That's really going to blunt a lot of criticism that Republicans may have wanted to direct towards these democratic achievements. And I think it's instructive that one of the last holdouts on the McCarthy deal was a South Carolina Republican who wanted to make sure that investments in solar and wind, particularly solar in her state, were protected from cuts to the tax credits from in last year's spending bills. So
It's amazing.
yeah, exactly. So, I think that there's certainly going to be a lot of campaign fodder here, but then you're going to have to deal with the fact that, as Marissa mentioned, a lot of these Republicans voted in favor of several of these bills, and they're now putting their constituents to work. And that is a very difficult thing to explain when it comes time to go to the polls.
Matt, anything else to add there before we wrap up?
I think my friends and colleagues did a great job answering that question.
Well, fantastic. If we don't have anything else from the audience, we will end it there. Thank you again for joining us. And again, awesome panel. Thank you guys for making the time to participate. And thank you to those who are attending. If you want to really hear any part of this conversation, if you missed part of it, it will be back up on our YouTube channel tomorrow. And we have a new podcast, Breakthrough Science with Prime Rivers Lab. You can find it on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your podcasts. We will have a recording of this up tomorrow as well. So please feel free to listen to it there and subscribe. We're trying to get the word out on that. So thank you all so much. Have a great day, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.